Someone who speaks the truth when their government is doing the wrong thing. Someone who speaks the truth, especially here. Especially here. We've got to take 9/11 back.
A 1,000 workmen removed 164 outdated buildings. Miles of telephone cables, pneumatic tubes, gas, steam, water, and sewer lines were relocated or removed. In 1969, from 70 feet below street level, the first tower rose toward its 1,350-foot destination. The unique tower design permitted many building activities normally accomplished in sequence to take place at the same time. Large open areas free of columns are a major feature of the tower buildings. Closely spaced vertical columns provide the load-bearing strength instead of the customary interior steel skeleton. In late 1970, the last piece of steel for the tower was hoisted over a quarter mile into position atop New York's tallest building. The North Tower of the World Trade Center was topped out in December 1970. The South Tower was completed in 1971.
Professor Stephen E. Jones conducted his PhD research at the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center in California and earned his PhD in physics from Vanderbilt University in 1978. Jones specializes in metal-catalyzed fusion, solar energy, and archaeometry, which utilizes advanced physics methods to determine what happened in the past from available evidence. It is this approach that Jones applies in pursuing 9/11 research.
As I looked into it for myself, I realized, wait a minute, there must be other examples if fires brought these buildings down. There were no examples. And even here, I get this argument from civil engineers, fires are sufficient, I say, well, give me some examples then, because these buildings, we have over 100 years of history now of these steel frame buildings. And I read that nearly every one of them in their lifetime has a fire, major fire. There had been a huge inferno in a building in Spain. And you could see it 24 hours, burning, burning, burning. The people thought it was going to collapse because the World Trade Centers buildings had collapsed. It did not. And you look at it and the steel beams and all concrete, I mean, sure, it was damaged dramatically, but the structure is there, the frame is still there. And that's the case in all other buildings, the structure remains. So I thought, that is really strange. We need to look at the evidence, the structural steel. If somehow that failed due to fire, we really want to know. This has never happened before in a high-rise steel frame building. So let's get the steel. And there were a number of people who said, we need to do a forensic analysis. We need to start putting it together, figuring out just how these connections, how the columns failed. What's going on? We have to understand this. I mean, there's many buildings like this, hundreds of buildings like this, we've got to understand so that this doesn't happen again.
3 government reports were released: the well-known 9/11 Commission report, the NIST report, and the FEMA BPAD report.
It was totally inadequate. The BPAT study was, for the size of this disaster, I mean, these are the two largest buildings in the world as far as the Twin Towers go, two of the largest buildings in the world to collapse, and yet we were throwing at it volunteer engineers with no money and no authority, basically.
The only access they had was one guide, what they described as a guided tour. They didn't even look at a single piece until like a month after the attack.
There was no NIST investigation. There was no $16 million. There was no federal look at this disaster other than the federal BPAT, and that's why we're very critical of BPAT. Again, not the individuals conducting it, but the way it was being conducted. It was, again, failed, to do what really needed to be done, and it stopped very short of what this disaster deserves.
It's a very well-designed building. Leslie Robertson and those gentlemen did a good job designing it, actually. It's not hollow. I get that argument from some people. They say, well, it's hollow, it's just weird. It's like a can, a soda pop can. No, it's got these huge core columns going up the center. This huge antennas, about 350 feet tall, is sitting on the core columns.
Kevin Ryan was a former manager for Environmental Health Laboratories, a water testing subsidiary of Underwriter Laboratories, or UL. UL certified the original World steel and performed steel tests for the NIST report. Months after being promoted to site manager of his division, Kevin Ryan was fired for publicly questioning the NIST draft report released in October of 2004.
They were given an award in 1971 by the American Society of Civil Engineers as being the greatest engineering achievement, the greatest contribution to engineering in mankind. So the American Society of Civil Engineers, right? So these were very well built buildings. John Skilling was given another award around about then by the AISC group, the American Institute of Steel Constructors. So these were award-winning buildings and award-winning engineers. John Skilling said he took all this airplane impacts and jet fuel fires into account and that the building structure would still be there. And the reason I believe he said that is these were totally over-designed for calamities. Obviously you're building these super high buildings, at the time the tallest buildings ever built. And they took into account aircraft impacts and jet fuel fires in their design.
With me is one of the architects who helped to design the World Trade Center, Aaron Swirsky.
Each floor by itself, it's sort of like an hermetic unit. It was designed even like for fire, that there were shutters that would shut off the ducts, the vertical openings, and that the fire couldn't travel from one floor to the other. Now that this collapsed, it's really an incredible thing.
It looked on the footage, what I saw on CNN, that the plane flew straight into the building.
Straight through him, right. Yeah.
So you're saying that the building was actually designed to cope with a hole like that and still survive?
Yeah, it was designed like that. Yeah, that's what happened. It was the explosion in 1993. If you remember that it opened a big hole in the structure, but it was at the end of the structure, and at that point the intent was to topple the building, to collapse, but because of the design it didn't collapse. But now I mean it's unbelievable. I don't know, it's just it was designed like to withstand something like that, and that's incredible because the entire design of the building was designed around that eventuality that an accident may occur.
The planes that crashed into the towers were 767-200s, and sometimes those are called jumbo jets. Well, they're actually not much bigger than the original plane that was in existence when the towers were built, which was a 707-340. They're actually fairly comparable. A 767 is slightly heavier than a 707. It has only a slightly higher fuel capacity, and a 767 has a cruising speed that is only 530 as opposed to 607 for a 707. Now, kinetic energy goes up with the square of velocity, so a typical crash event of a 707 would actually involve more kinetic energy, and the planes that crashed into the towers didn't have anywhere near their full fuel load. They only had about 10,000 gallons, according to official estimates. You have an event that's well within the design parameters of the building, and then the official story has that these buildings turned into dust and small pieces of shredded steel as a result of